Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
All right, we're going to pick our series up again in Matthew 24, verse 7. In that first lesson last week on the Olivet Discourse, we left Yeshua and the Talmudim, his disciples, up on the Mount of Olives, looking down on the Temple Mount and on the city of Jerusalem. And the Talmudim, the disciples, were vocalizing how impressive the sight of the temple and all of the buildings around the temple and everything were. And you have to remember that in its day and age, the temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was very impressive. But Yeshua, then, as they're making these comments, rips through their thinking by telling them that not one stone will be left standing on another, speaking of the temple itself. This, of course, blows the Talmudim's minds. What's going on here? How can this possibly be? So they ask Yeshua what, in essence, is a compound question, a three-part question, and the Olivet Discourse is an answer to that question, that three-part question. And the three parts are, one, when will this happen? That is directly referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Next part of the question, 2, when will be the time of your coming or your returning to Yeshua? And the final part of that question, number 3, is when will be the end of the age? When will be the end of the age? Now, we have to figure that what they had in mind for the answers to all these questions and what Yeshua knew and what history has borne out are two totally different things. They were looking for immediacy. Yeshua knew that that would not be, and our history has proven that it's been almost 2,000 years, so we haven't had that thing. Last lesson we looked at their idea that idea being the destruction of the temple would usher in the Messianic age. That at the destruction of the temple, Yeshua would return, and that would be the end of the current age. Well, Yeshua knows what's on their minds. And so, having been asked this compound question, which they hope will verify their thinking, Yeshua sets about giving them the correct answer. The answer he gives addresses each of the three parts of the question that they've asked, but not in the way that they were anticipating. And be forewarned, I'm going to tell you guys right up front that what we're going to look at this evening is not very pretty. There's some things in here that you never hear taught because people that teach don't want to teach stuff like this to the congregations. We left off at verse 6 of Matthew chapter 24 last time, so let's begin with Yeshua speaking still in Matthew 24, 7 and 8. It says, "For the peoples will fight each other, nations will fight each other. There will be famines and earthquakes in various parts of the world." Verse 8, "All of this is but the beginning of the birth pains." Hold on to that. Make that refrigerator art. All of this that he's mentioned in that verse 7 is but the beginning of the birth pains. Next. Let's go on to Mark. For the peoples will fight each other, and the nations will fight each other. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines, but this is but the beginning of the birth pains. This is being emphasized in both Gospels, Matthew and Mark, and then Luke. Then he, that would be Yeshua, told them, peoples will fight each other, nations will fight each other. There will be great earthquakes. He's amplified the earthquake thing a little bit. Hang on to great earthquakes because that's very true. There will be epidemics, which Luke has added here, and things, and famines in various places. And there will be fearful sights and great signs in the heavens. We tend to look at these things that have been mentioned here as just applying to us here at the end of the age. But actually, before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era, all of these kinds of things were occurring. Even the fearful sights, even sights that were kind of beyond comprehension, like the great signs in the heavens that Luke states here. Wars and rumors of war were a fact of life before and after the fall of Jerusalem. These prophecies also fulfilled across the centuries. These same things have been happening ever since then on an ongoing basis across the centuries. It can be said that during the last 300 years, there's been over 300 wars taking place in Europe alone. Many of us, from personal experience, can tell you that wars are increasing in intensity. They're getting uglier and uglier. Some of us, I guess just me at this point, we're alive with memories of things from World War II. That war included almost the entire globe. First time that had happened, it was the most deadly war in all of history to that point. More human life was lost in World War II than in any war before it. In verse 11 of Luke, Luke lists great earthquakes, famines, epidemics, and terrors, and great signs from the heavens. And it's interesting that just prior to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era, these kinds of events literally took place. Literally took place. Then in 61 Common Era, there was a severe earthquake took place in the Asian or eastern portion of Turkey that did huge damage. In 63 Common Era, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius covered Pompeii. There was an earthquake with that volcanic eruption. And there were famines during the reigns of Claudius and Nero. Nero was reigning from 54 to 68. And the war which led to the capture and destruction of Jerusalem began in 66, Common Era. So all this stuff that they're talking about was going on there. Now there's a historian named Adolf Schlatter who writes, and I'm going to quote from him, agitation of the Jews from 66 to 70 A.D. did in fact bring forth terrifying apparitions in heaven. Read that again. Agitation of the Jews from 66 to 70 A.D. did in fact bring forth terrifying apparitions in heaven, warring armies, and a comet and great signs. A comet and great signs. The self-opening of the temple gates took place during this time. There was an audible departure of celestial beings from the temple at this time. Josephus, in his War of the Jews, Book 6, Chapter 6, Section 3, also reports essentially these same things. I'm going to quote from Josephus here. A false prophet, and this is within the city itself, a false prophet was the occasion of these people's destructions, talking about all of those that died in the temple. Remember, we talked a bit last week about how that the temple floor and the garden around the temple was littered so thick with bodies you couldn't see the ground under it. Tens of thousands were killed on the Temple Mount. And again, the question from last week and now is, what were they doing there? And Josephus says that a false prophet was the occasion for these people's destructions. The false prophet made a public declaration in the city that very day of things that were going on. And that public declaration was that God commanded them to get up to the temple, and that they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance when they got there. Now, Josephus goes on to say that there are a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants. They were done this way to impose on the people who denounced this that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting. They didn't want anybody leaving Jerusalem, so they sent in these false prophets to say, stay, find out things. God's going to do great things. Go to the temple and hang out. And they did this because they thought they might be buoyed up well above fear and care by such hopes. Now, understand that this sets us up for section 3, where Josephus records this. And I've got a copy that all of you can take with you when we leave. There were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, such as belied or misrepresented God himself, while they did not attend or give credit to the signs that were so evident and did so plainly foretell their future desolance, but like men infatuated without eyes to see or minds to consider, they did not regard the denunciations that God made to them, and here are the fateful signs. Thus there was a star resembling a sword that stood over the city. That sign actually took place. And a comet that came and occupied the skies over Jerusalem for a whole year. This also, before the Jews' rebellion and before these commercials that preceded the war that followed, when the people would come in great crowds to the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 8th day of the month, Nisan, and in the 9th hour of the night, so great a light came on and was shown around the altar. These are things unusual that are going on, that are happening, that are being reported as having happened. They're not listed for us in Scripture, but they're listed by 3 different people who are writing in this age. A great light shone around the altar and in the holy house, and that it appeared to be bright as daytime, and it lasted about a half an hour. And this is in the night. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskilled, but it was also interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend to those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival, also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Now, this is all strange stuff that's going on. Please understand this. This is all strange stuff that's going on. You're going to have to work your way back through most of this to kind of get a feel for it. But at the same time, as all this stuff else that's been mentioned here is going on that's not quite kosher in man's mind, at the same festival, also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed. Now, a heifer was always brought in and burned up completely, so they had the ashes of the red heifer, which were necessary for the operation and the cleansing of the temple. And this red heifer brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. So we got to think about that for a minute or two. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been opened and closed with difficulty only by an accumulation of up to 20 men, rested on the basis of iron, with iron bolts fastened very deep into a firm floor, which was made of one solid stone, and it was seen to have just flowed open on its own. Just flowed open on its own about the 6th hour in the night, as all this bright lights and everything else is going on. And there were other events cited which related with the signs of heaven. Now, I've just been reading all of that, and some of it was a little hard to comprehend, but I've been quoting what has been being said by our man that is the witness to this and feeding all this information basically to us. Also know that the Roman historian Tacitus recorded these events in his works as well. So we have three different secular historians making mention of these phenomena. Now Yeshua states that all of these things that are listed by these three secular reporters, if you will, these are the beginnings of the birth pains. They're not mentioned in Scripture in any kind of real great detail, but they are given to us. Mark includes the statement that it's the beginning of the birth pangs, but Luke up here omits it, doesn't say anything about that. This statement, birth pangs, had a technical meaning in the rabbinic literature of the time, and that particular expression, birth pangs, corresponded to a rabbinic expression that was in use at that time in the middle of the first century A.D. And that is, the rabbinic expression was, this was the birth pang of the Messiah. This was the birth pang of the Messiah. And I see blank looks and questioning looks, but that was what was actually going on among the rabbis there. Now, the birth pang of the Messiah, which is referring to the distress period that precedes the Messianic age, is what we're looking at. And it's referring to a period of intense suffering preceding deliverance by the Messiah. In the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, the birth pangs are a recurring image of divine judgment, often with future events connected to the end times. And the statement here by Yeshua is indicating the events he's talking about here are just the beginning of the birth pangs. These are just the beginning of the birth pains, and is telling the Talmudim, the disciples, that the time until the return of himself isn't going to be instant, it's going to be an extended period. To be sure, these events prophesied here will have significance both at the time they occurred, but they will also have significance when we get to the end time events, to the final goal. But they're now just stepping stones leading to that final goal. Let's go to Jeremiah 30, verse 1 through 9. I want you to think about this. This is a synopsis of the end times events that's being given to us by the prophet Jeremiah well in advance. This word came to Jeremiah from Adonai. This is what Adonai, the God of Israel, says. Write all the words I have spoken to you in a scroll. For the day is coming, says Adonai, when I will reverse the exile of my people Israel and Judah, says Adonai, and I will cause them to return to the land I gave their ancestors, and they will take possession of it. Well, I've seen that happen in my lifetime. Next. These are the words Adonai spoke concerning Israel and Judah. Here's what Adonai says. We have heard a cry of terror, of fear, and not peace. Ask now and see, can men give birth to children? Why then do I see all the men with their hands on their stomachs like women in labor, every face turned pale? Hold there. This is talking about a time coming when it's going to scare the dickens out of all humanity. It's going to be so bad that men are going to be holding their hands with their stomachs like women in labor, every face turned pale. Next. How dreadful that day will be. There has never been one like it, a time of trouble for Jacob, but out of it he will be saved. Verse 8, on that day, says Adonai Tzevaot, I will break his yoke off your neck. That's Satan. I will snap your chains. Foreigners will no longer enslave him. Instead, they will serve Adonai their God, that's Israel, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Guess who David the king is going to be raised up at that time will be? The returning Yeshua. Returning Yeshua. Now, essentially, what we're looking at here is our current time is being pointed to, and it will appear that these first birth pangs around the time of the destruction of the temple are just the first stepping stone to the events of the end time. The birth pangs will increase and increase and increase up till the time of Jacob's trouble, becoming incredibly intense as we get to the end. It is by them the end of the age is both foreshadowed and brought closer. It's foreshadowed by what goes on at the time of Yeshua's first coming and with the original disciples. It's foreshadowed then, but we're also seeing as we're moving through this time frame now, it being brought closer, and it shows us that God's eternal plan is going forward. Going forward. We'll see later in Matthew 24:33 that at the end of the current age, which is the time of the Gentiles, the indicated disturbances that we've been looking at here, that this is saying this is only the beginning, the indicated disturbances will occur together and probably be more numerous, more extensive, widespread, more frequent, more fearful than before, and such events are to take place in conjunction with the Messiah's second coming, which is what the disciples wanted to know how soon this was going to be, thinking it would be as soon as the temple was destroyed. Some of the signs that portend the birth pangs are currently increasing today in intensity and frequency. Now, one sign that we have that we're getting close is obviously Israel's rebirth, which was prophesied for us, that this is going to happen. And when it happens, God's going to lead us through this. Can a nation be born in a day was the question that was raised, and the answer is yes. May 14th, 1948. The UN voted in 1947. The nations on the earth voted to let Israel become a nation, and on May 14th, they declared themselves effectively a state up and running. This is in and of itself a miracle about how events lined up for that could happen. We could talk for weeks on that, I believe. Then, of course, there's the plummeting morality that's going on in the world today that's also part of this. Studies show a shocking breakdown of morals just in the last 55 to 60 years. A study of wars since the year 500 Common Era shows that there's a recent dramatic increase there also. More than 100 conflicts have erupted between 1990 and 2001. About twice the number happened during that period as was for the previous decade. Earthquakes at 6 or greater on the Richter scale. In the 1940s, there were only a handful. In the 1990s, over 1,500. I was going to look up the numbers that are going on this year so far, and I just never got a chance to, but it's still increasing. It's gone, if you chart it, from the beginning of the 20th century to just kind of floating along till after Israel becomes a state, and then it begins to turn up, and now the difference each year is almost a straight vertical climbing line, going up in the increasing numbers of earthquakes over 6. There are variations in the earthquakes listed depending on whose data is used, but in all cases the increase is dramatic. There's an increase in apostasy among those who claim they're believers. I just can't believe some of the things that I hear coming out of the mouths of those that are preaching sermons these days that are right in the face of the Bible. The huge jump in worship attendance immediately after 9/11 happened is an indicator that the increase in apostasy among believers has had, because they were drifting away, getting more interested in doing other stuff rather than coming to worship God. And all of a sudden we had 9/11 and bang, the churches were full again. Congregations were being slam dunked. This current time is also unusual in that the gospel is being spread at an absolutely astounding rate in our day and age as compared to what it was. This is speaking to the worldwide phenomenon, not just to Europe and to the English-speaking world. Record numbers of new believers worldwide are happening, and it's virtually unreported to us by the media. Now, it's not unreasonable to consider the final outbreak of the mentioned terrors as accompanying signs of the returning Messiah. However, one should not be misled by those who learnedly speak about these signs of the times and refer to this or that terrible battle or serious earthquake or terrible famine as a definitive sign of his return, or that any one of these kinds of events, maybe a combination of these kinds of events, is an infallible sign of a Messiah's immediate return. We have to be careful about that. The time is approaching that he will return, but we're still in the twinges. We're in the early parts of this. Hard labor hasn't set in yet. Now, I'm going to do a little change in format. Last week and up until now, this evening, we've been looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's passage on the same thing together and commenting on it. But as we read Matthew 24:9 through 14 and comment on it, and then move on to Mark's version and comment on it, and then Luke, instead of reading all three and commenting on them, the complexity of each has become so much that it really no longer warrants that approach. So we're going to look at each of these passages now separately and do our commenting. So let's begin with Matthew 24:9 through 14. It says, "At that time you will be arrested and handed over to be punished and put to death. All of the peoples will hate you because of me. At that time many will be trapped into betraying and hating each other. Many false prophets will appear and fool many people, and many people's love will grow cold because of increased distance from Torah. But whoever holds out till the end will be delivered. And this good news about the kingdom will be announced throughout the whole world as a witness to all of the Goyim, all of the Gentiles. It is then that the end will come." Yeshua is talking about taking everything he's been discussing with his disciples up to that point and taking it out to the end of the age. Verse 9 begins with "at that time." Some translations also will have the word "then." Then at that time, implying chronological order at this point in the chapter. Well, there is chronological order to the chapter, but there is not an absolute chronology of order here in this passage. The events that we're looking at now occur partly before, partly during, and partly after previous prophecies. They form the continuation of the birth woes. The body of Messiah in its broadest sense is now the subject of what's being talked about. The sources of dangers to the body of Messiah are pinpointed. Number one, there will be internal dangers from heresies and false prophets. There will be internal dangers from heresies and false prophets. Number two, there will be a decay of the faith. Verses 10 and 12. Number three, internal and external forms of persecution. Internal and external forms of persecution are going to take place. Verse 13, they will enter into glory, be delivered, be redeemed. Up until this time, none of these events by themselves definitively indicated the end. And the warning is not to pay undue attention to such constantly repeated disturbances. Don't pay attention to them. They're going to happen for the next 1,000, we've discovered almost 2,000 years. And very often, if they're taken at the wrong emphasis, they become false signs. Verse 14, though, it's interesting that there is a change. And this good news about the kingdom will be announced throughout the whole world as a witness to all the Goyim. It is then that the end will come. The good news will be preached to the whole world, to all of the Gentiles, as a witness to them. And this gives rise to the statement, then shall come the end. That word then does not necessarily mean instantly, though, or immediately. What is said in verse 14 is the concluding event of world history. This concluding event or events of world history are to be preceded by the preaching of the good news of the kingdom to all of the world. All of the world. After which the end will come. How quickly it'll come is not evident. How long will it take for the word to reach all of the goyim? Well, it's not too much being told to us about that, but I'm telling you a thing that I picked up off the internet this week. It says Middle East Christians risking all, preaching in deadly Muslim areas. It's going on, yet we're getting no real news about all of it. Christians are continuing to share the gospel, even in highly dangerous areas in the Middle East where the Islamic State terror group remains in the minds of the people. Goyim, in this case, means all of the nations, all of the Gentiles, and it means to all people. Let's go to Revelation 14:6, please. Next I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with everlasting good news to proclaim to those living on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. That's an angel of God that the book of Revelation tells us is going to be flying in mid-heaven with that everlasting good news to proclaim to all of those living on the earth, every nation, tribe, language, and people. And since this is being done by an angelic being, a spiritual activity, if you will, there's no reason that all individuals on the world wouldn't have that knowledge placed in their mind to accept or reject as they choose. Once this has occurred, then the end can come, but not before. Everybody has to have a chance to accept or reject. And it appears that this is well underway and going on right now. Let's go to Mark 13:9 through 13. But you watch yourselves. This is speaking to his disciples then, but it's also speaking to us now. They will hand you over to local Sanhedrins. You will be beaten up in synagogues, that is, in congregations. And on my account you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Indeed, the good news has to be proclaimed first to all of the Goyim, all of the Gentiles. Now, when they arrest you and bring you to trial, don't worry beforehand about what to say next. Rather, say whatever is given to you when the time comes, for it will not be just you speaking, but the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, speaking through you. Verse 12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will turn against their parents and have them put to death. That's startling when you read that. Children will turn against their parents and have them put to death, and everyone will hate you because of me. That's Yeshua. But whoever holds out to the end will be delivered. You know, if you think about it, you remember this past week or so, there was a pastor being held in Turkey for preaching the good news to the Muslims, Pastor Andrew Brunson, and he's been released. He could be an example for us of someone very deeply involved in this very thing that's laid out for us in prophecy. If we're paying attention, it's interesting to note that Mark is omitting any reference to time here. Matthew keeps saying at that time. Mark omits any reference in this passage. Mark, though, begins with an admonishment. Watch yourselves. Watch yourselves. Be careful how you go about this. Make sure you're doing it right, etc. Much like the passage in Matthew, the focus is on the suffering that is to be experienced by those addressed, not only just those before Yeshua. This is to be something that's being addressed. That's to us, not just those that are standing before him. His disciples there on the Mount of Olives, but also disciples at the end of the age. We're talking pastors, teachers, missionaries. the Messianic movement itself as it invades foreign lands and Israel itself. We're talking about things that are going to happen like rejection, but there'll also be physical abuse in some cases, persecution in the form of arrest in some cases because of the identification of those bringing forth the word, their identification with Yeshua, because Yeshua is becoming less and less favorably accepted across the entire world. Notice how these experiences that he is telling them they will encounter are much like those that Yeshua himself experienced. What Yeshua is telling his disciples that they will experience, and those that follow them, such as us, are going to experience, and they're going to be much like what he experienced himself, or soon would experience, because his day of execution was closing in on him as he's giving these words. Now, in the latter part of verse 9, the phrase about governors and kings designates all men of authority. And it's believed that this is speaking to something beyond just local arrests, but arrests being made throughout the empire. Now, the empire at that time was the Roman Empire. But if you bring that empire up to the end of the age, the empire is going to be worldwide. So whatever he's talking about here that's going on in the empire is going to be worldwide. Verse 10 states that the good news must be proclaimed first to the Goyim, to the Gentiles, before the end of the age can occur. And this seems to interrupt the flow between verses 9 and 11. However, its position there makes it clear that it is the preaching of the good news to the Gentiles that is the offense that we're going to be hurt badly for. And again, we have to point in towards the world of Islam, plus all their false gods. And it's what's bringing public action against these believers doing that the good news is being preached to the unbelieving Gentiles. Look today at how much of the world already prohibits the bringing of the gospel to any of their citizenry with extremely stiff penalties in place. All of Islam, and I can list places beyond that, major religions in India, if they catch you, will lynch you right on the spot. But God has his angel in reserve, his angel that we looked at just a minute ago, to make sure that the word is spread. And again, this word first here points to the fact that this is a happening that must happen first to the Gentiles. They must be given the word and understand what is available to them. What happens after that is not really spelled out here, but in Matthew, we learn that as after this, the good news is spread, that the end of the age can come. The end of the age can come, and that would be the end of the age, the return of Messiah. I think this indicates that it might be virtually impossible to spread the good news just prior to Messiah's return. The reason that God has this angel ready is because it will become virtually impossible for us to spread the good news. But his angel will be out there to assure that everybody will have the opportunity to hear. Verse 11. Verse 11 is very practical in nature. It explains a part of the meaning of I am with you always, even until the end of the age. Before we go there, though, I want us to look quickly at Matthew 28:16 through 20. So the 11 Talmudim went to the hill in the Galilee where Yeshua told them to go. When they saw him, they prostrated themselves before him, but some hesitated. Now that's important that we understand that. Even at that point, it was yet some of his disciples that hadn't 100% sold out to him. The whole thing is so hard to comprehend. Yeshua came and talked with them, and he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Next, therefore go and make people from all nations, that's all the Gentiles, into disciples, immersing them into the reality of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I will be with you always, yes, even to the end of the age. Even to the end of the age. So we're taking basically from him being with them to his coming back. And he'll be all across there for all of us that are working to do this. Now, go back to Mark 13:11 through 13, please. Now, when they arrest you and bring you to trial, don't worry beforehand about what to say. Rather, say whatever is given you when the time comes, for it will not be just you speaking, but the Ruach HaKodesh. Brother will betray brother to death, the father his child. Children will turn against their parents and have them put to death. And everyone will hate you because of me, Yeshua. But whoever holds out till the end will be delivered. I told you it was going to get a little ugly before we got through with this tonight. The Talmudim, it's telling us here, are not to be filled with anxiety with regard to what they are to say in their defense when arrested or brought before the authorities. They're not to be concerned with the charges brought against them or the judicial proceedings or even the lack of a defense counsel. They're to rely on the presence of the Holy Spirit, for the Holy Spirit will actually speak through them. Extend that to include these of us that are now here at the end of the age. Verses 11 and 12 expand, give greater detail on what will occur. An increase in wickedness. Love of many people will grow cold, which may in practical times be interpreted here as brother betrays brother to death. A father, his child, and children will turn against their parents and have them put to death. That's something that's almost beyond our kind of comprehension in the U.S. Everyone will hate you because of me, but whoever holds out until the end will be delivered. See, there will be no love or trust by the world of anyone who puts his or her faith in Yeshua. It isn't going to happen. Look at Micah 7:5-6, please. Don't trust in your neighbor. Don't put confidence in a close friend. Shut the gates of your mouth, even from your wife lying there in the bed with you. For a son insults his father, a daughter rises against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A person's enemies are members of his own household. So much is in that Old Testament that Yeshua is applying to us to be paying attention to as we're approaching the end of the age. Now, why all this going on? What's the motivation behind all this, where everyone will hate all of us because of Yeshua? This most probably are going to follow three major themes. Number one, an intense hatred of the good news and all that it stands for that is transferred to a friend or family member. As we're trying to be witnesses, they're going to rebel. In other words, that hatred that they have for the good news for Yeshua and what it stands for, transferred into a family member or friend that holds Yeshua and the good news, it's going to be against us. 2, maybe it's a desire to save one's own skin, redirect the focus of authorities away from themselves. Or 3, a desire to win the approval of the world through rejection of Messiah. See, understand in that number 2, where it says a desire to save one's own skin, it's not talking about your salvation through Messiah. It's talking about saving your own skin from the world coming and taking you out. In verse 3, a desire to win approval of the world through rejection of Messiah by betraying believers. See, if I can get my parents slain, I've really proven that I'm who I am, and they'll leave me alone from now on, right? We should note here that the assistance of the Holy Spirit to those of us that are witnessing does not necessarily mean that we're going to have an acquittal. Our hope is in being vindicated before the judgment seat of Messiah. Escape from death at the hands of man is not promised. It's not even inferred here. In summation, the followers of Yeshua will be hated because of him, because of Yeshua. And it might work itself out in different scenarios, but our bottom line is the same. The abuse is directed towards Yeshua, and one important fact asserts itself: the severity of the test is not minimized. Instead, the people of God need to be steadfast. Those that persevere will be vindicated by God, and the thought is for complete reliance on God in a hostile world. And we know that the disciples that heard these words experienced this kind of prosecution. Consider this business of children having their parents put to death for a moment. It's kind of a chilling statement. Think about this. What's being talked about in this prophecy is global in nature, not just in a particular nation or a particular ethnic group. But this is a global phenomenon. It's very difficult to comprehend. How could this occur globally? Well, back in 1995, there was an article by James Dobson in his newsletter, and I'm going to expand on that. This is in regard to a resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which was titled The Convention of the Rights of the Child. The Convention of the Rights of the Child, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. We're talking about children having their parents put to death. This is difficult for us to follow, but what has to happen is for the government to interpose itself into the family to an extraordinary extent, much more than we tend to think of in this country at this point in time. But if you want to go to the internet, you can find out that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child came into force September 2nd, 1990. There's 45 of these rights of the child. And it's interesting that all of the nations of the earth have adopted this, except two, the United States and South Sudan. All other nations have adopted this, and we're close. We have to understand the implications of this. Now, here's some pertinent articles. I'm just going to read you a few of them, of this UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I'm going to give you a carry-out, a take-home, so be sure and pick up a copy of this before you leave. Article 13 of this grants freedom of expression and right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, either orally in writing or in print, in the form of art or other media of a child's choice. In other words, the child has got this right to do all these things. Note that no allowance is made for possible parental supervision based on the family standards of decency. Article 14 guarantees children freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. The parental role is only to provide state-monitored influence. If a neighbor or teacher induces your children to a Muslim faith or to any other religious viewpoint, you as a parent would be powerless to redirect that child's interest under this UN thing. Article 15 prohibits any restriction of the children's freedom of association except as required for national security, public safety or order, public health or morals, or to protect the rights and freedoms of others. There is no parental right here to oppose what the parent would deem as an undesirable relationship. Parental rights have in effect been eliminated by this. Remember, it takes a village to raise a child, that saying. Article 16 grants the child a right of privacy. You have to realize that the United States Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade was based on the right of privacy. The question is, children's privacy from whom? Answer, from the parents. Article 17 entrusts to the mass media the responsibility for providing children with information and material for their social, spiritual, and moral well-being. Read that again. Entrusts to the mass media. How much do you trust the mass media? Well, this entrusts to the mass media the responsibility for providing children with information and material for their social, spiritual, and moral well-being and physical and mental health. This is scary. The question is, do we trust the media with the souls of our children? Article 18 grants the children of all working parents the right to benefit from child care services. And the thought is, What this could lead to would be universal child care with state control of all individuals and institutions that are providing it. Article 24 requires governments to develop family planning services like Planned Parenthood. These are just 6 that I've given you of the 45 articles of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, accepted by all of the nations of the world except 2. Again, and those 2 are the United States and South Sudan. That makes a strange bedfellows, doesn't it? Us and the South Sudan. But here's the clinker. The U.S. signed this agreement February 16th, 1995. We've signed it. What we haven't done is had our Congress ratify that. That's the only thing that remains. In his 2008 campaign for president, Barack Obama declared this failure to ratify is embarrassing. All that's needed for us to be on board with this is the right president and the right cast in the Senate to push this through and ratify it. We're that close. What we see from this, though, is really the die is cast already on a worldwide basis for children to turn their parents over to be killed. Now, 100 years ago, on a global basis, that statement where children turn their parents over to be killed was incomprehensible. As an individual nation might do that, but on a global basis, it just wasn't going to happen. Look at how far we've come in just 100 years, setting up for prophecy of the end of the age to be fulfilled. And here's the foundation of it. It takes a village to raise a child, a global village. Luke covers essentially the same material here as Matthew and Mark. In Luke 12, he places the persecution of believers before all the other things. The language in the Aramaic indicates that before the destruction of Jerusalem and the terrifying events that precede it, the disciples would have to endure persecution. Historically, this took place as Yeshua had prophesied. Acts chapter 4, Kepha and Yochanan, Peter and John were summoned before the Sanhedrin. Acts 5:17, disciples are in prison. In Acts 5:40, the disciples are beaten. Acts 6:8, Stephen was stoned to death. Acts 12:1 and 2, Yaakov, James, the brother of Yochanan, John, was put to death by Herod. Paul and others were continually being dragged before the pagan governors and judges. All of the prophecies by Yeshua given in Luke 21:12 were fulfilled in the years between his ascension and the destruction of the temple. And this is giving us a picture of some of the things that we're going to have to be aware of as the end of the age approaches. Verse 13 tells us the result of these persecutions. The faithful will have the opportunity to witness, and doing so will honor the Lord. Verses 14 through 15. Yeshua tells the Talmudim not to be anxious about what to say in their defense. Yeshua promises the Holy Spirit provides the words, the wisdom to refute any acts their persecutors may bring against them. And here again, there's no promise of acquittal. Verse 16, like Mark, it tells of betrayal by family and friends and being put to death. As far as we can tell, all of the Talmudim except John were put to death. Thaddeus went to Persia where he was crucified in 73 Common Era. Philip went to southwest Turkey where he was scourged and crucified in 52 Common Era. Matthew went to northern Iraq area where he was slain by the sword in 60 Common Era. Mark was dragged through the streets, put in a dungeon, and the next morning burned to death in Alexandria, Egypt. I have no date on that. Yaakov, James, the son of Alphaeus, was beaten and stoned to death in Jerusalem by order of the high priest, 62 Common Era. James, Yaakov, the brother of John, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa in 44 Common Era. Andrew, the brother of Peter, was tied to a cross in the form of an X. He hung there for 3 days. It is recorded that for those 3 days he told the people that gathered there about the love of Messiah. After 3 days, the governor decided he'd had enough and ordered him set free. When he cut his ropes, he fell off dead on the ground. Peter was crucified by Nero upside down in Rome. Shaul, Saul, was beheaded by Nero in Rome in 66 Common Era. Thomas was killed in India by pagan priests thrust through by a spear. Luke went to Africa and then to Britain. We don't have a date on when he was killed. Bartholomew preached in many countries, is said to have translated Matthew into pagan languages. Some sources say he was thrust through with a sword. Others say he was beaten to death. Shimon, Simeon the Zealot, preached in Africa and Britain, was crucified by pagans in 74 Common Era. John was ordered placed in a cauldron of boiling oil by the Emperor Domitian. Either the sentence wasn't carried out or a miracle saved him. He was banished to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of the Revelation. Then Domitian died. John was sent back to Ephesus, where he died a natural death at age, they say, 100. He is the only one to die a natural death. So you can see how these prophecies to the Talmudim were fulfilled so exactly. Verse 17, the reason for this relentless persecution is that is fired by hatred. And this hatred is directed against Yeshua and those that believe and serve Yeshua, who in the absence of Yeshua are recipients of this hatred from total strangers and friends and even close relatives. Verse 18 says, though, not on a hair in your head will perish, while verse 16 talks about being put to death. So this can only be fully understood from a spiritual level, that our resurrection will take place. Our resurrection will take place, that the faithful will receive bodily perfection and a glorified body. Verse 19, the literal translation of this verse, you will gain possession of your souls or lives. The meaning is to have true salvation. As we end this, I want to really read Luke 21:12 again, please. But before all this, they will arrest you and persecute you, handing you over to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors. This will be on account of me, Yeshua, but it will prove an opportunity for you to bear witness, so make up your minds not to worry, rehearsing your defense beforehand. For I myself will give you eloquence and wisdom that no adversary will be able to resist or refute. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends. Some of you they will have put to death. And everyone will hate you because of me. But not a hair on your head will be lost. By standing firm, you will save your lives. We will have true salvation by standing firm. I'm often asked why there will be such a falling away by those claiming to be Yeshua's Messiah at the end of the age, because we see a lot of information on that. Well, I believe that'll be in part because the body at large isn't anticipating what's going to be happening at the end of the age. They're not being taught that it's going to get this ugly because pastors, teachers don't want to teach this. Well, now it's going to be the leadership, the teachers, those that are out pursuing this, that are going to be sought out, as it was back then among the original disciples. But that's going to cause a real scare into the overall body of Messiah at that time. And I believe that's why there'll be such a falling away from those claiming to be Yeshua's Messiah. See, that scare in the body of Messiah at that time will really help open the door for the false Messiah, who will show up and say who he is and offer his version of salvation to them for their taking. But I read the back of the book, we win.